Good morning, brothers and sisters. Happy Sabbath. It's been a real privilege for me and my wife Kathy to be here these last few days. Over the last several years, 5-6 years, I've been in many places around the U.S., but mostly overseas in other countries and other cultures. And it's great to be there and to see how broad and big God's family is, but it's also good to be home. And this conference is home, our home. And to be here and to see old friends and to see former students and see pastors that I've had in class and all these kinds of things, it's been a tremendous blessing. And we really appreciate the welcome that we've been given here. The leadership of this conference is in good hands, and appreciate their work, appreciate their support and what they're doing here. Well, we've had some time together talking about the God of the Old Testament, right? What do you do with the God of the Old Testament? Now, we believe it's part of the Bible, but there have been heresies in the past that say it's not. There have been Christians today who are worried whether it's really something that we should spend much time on. You may have had some neighbors, Sunday Christians, who said that the Old Testament isn't really worth a whole lot. It's law, and what we're really into is grace. Now, you know that I don't believe that after a couple days, right? And I hope you don't believe that either, because the God of the Old Testament is the same God who is the God of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the same God is dealing with human beings on the basis of grace. So it's the same God and the same grace, and we've been talking about it the last couple days. Evidence for that and how it works out in our lives in a positive way. And we have our final conclusion today. What we're going to talk about is challenges to that grace. The questions. And some people wanted me to start with that. After my first meeting, somebody came and said, I've had real questions. My kids have had questions. When are you going to deal with the problem text? And I thought, just wait. A couple days. We're going to try to do it. Not that we could do it all at once. But there's one other thing I want to just correct a little bit, make clear a little bit from yesterday. We talked about, remember what we talked about? Stories, right? Stories of people, stories of grace, stories of war. And I talked about how important stories were in communicating the gospel. And I may have separated between theology and story just a little bit. I didn't mean to do that. All I was saying is God uses stories to give theology. We learn about God through those stories, and that's one of the best ways that God uses to do it, as well as simple statements of doctrine. So theology and story are not opposed. Good stories lead to good theology and talk about God. Well, today, 3 challenges, 3 key objections to grace in the Old Testament. 3 questions that people have, and these are not only questions that come within the church, they come outside the church, for there are some atheists, agnostics, etc., who are the ones who raise these kinds of questions to us. Maybe unbelievers, but some people in the church who are honest and see these texts have questions. So there are 3 objections I want to talk about, and then try to give answers. Not that I could give all the answers, but some suggestions of some things that have been helpful to me and hopefully may be helpful to you as we deal with this issue. Okay? Challenge number 1. Objection number 1. Some people say that the God of the Old Testament is a legalist. That righteousness by works is taught in the Old Testament. And people are saved not by God's grace, necessarily, maybe grace helps, but by keeping law and being obedient. Okay? Some people say that. Now, there's a number of texts that you could use. There's a lot of places. I just want to give one example because When I was working on finalizing what I wanted to say today, I suddenly realized I had far too many texts and far too much stuff. I had enough stuff for 2 or 3 or 4 lectures, not just one. So I'm going to try to not unload the whole bit on you. You know, I promise I'll be out on time. I had to kind of narrow things down here a little bit. So I'm going to deal with just a few texts. But just as example, one of them, Deuteronomy 11, you see it on the overhead, 26 to 28. This is what says, "Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I commanded you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I command you today to go after other gods which you have not known." So some people look at that and say, okay, it says obey, and I'm going to bless you. Disobey, and I'm going to curse you. There are a number of texts in the Bible that say this. What do you say in answer to this? I'll give you some hints in just a little while. There's a second issue. There's a second question about God. Some people say God is a destroyer. God is a destroyer. And you can look at a couple stories. I've listed a couple things here. Pharaoh's army during the Exodus. Pharaoh's army is destroyed by God. 2 Chronicles 20, you have 2 foreign nations which are against Israel, and they're destroyed. Achan we'll talk about later, but Jericho, let's just look at one text. Jericho, Joshua 6:21. Joshua 6:21, and this is about Jericho. And it says, and this would be under the command of God, okay, they utterly did what? Destroyed all that was in the city, both men, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Okay. Destruction. Is God a destroyer? Now, this is a foreign nation, a foreign country. These are opposers to God, and some people might say, well, that's okay. But it also happens to sinners in Israel. If you want to look at Numbers 16, I won't read it, but in Numbers 16 it talks about Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Remember the story? Rebelled against Moses. And what happened to them? The earth opened up and swallowed them. Some people say, look, there it is. God not only destroys foreign nations or against Israel, but he also destroys, if needed, Israelites. God is a destroyer. Is God a destroyer? Well, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Third objection, okay? Third objection. What is that? Some people say God is unfair and unjust. Okay? If you could go, that's part of what the accusation is. And there are several things that you can look at. One of the biggest things that people look at is Achan. Joshua chapter 7. You remember what happened to Achan. Achan was not supposed to take anything away, and he took things away and he buried them in his tent, hid them. Israel failed in their next attempt to progress in their occupation of the land of Canaan, and it was because sin was in the camp, and when they found out where the sin was, Achan was destroyed, and who else? You remember? His family and what? Everything. His animals. Everything. Some people say, how's that fair? What about his children and so forth? My students ask that question. What about his children? What about his animals? What did they do? How come they're destroyed? Okay? These are the three major questions that I've had asked to me. Is God a legalist? Does God destroy? And is God fair? Well, let's try some answers, okay? Let's try some answers. Number one, we need to look at the sequence. Look at the order of what's happening. Okay? Now that's very important. Some things, it's important to do things in the right order. I said, give me some illustrations, and my wife gave me an illustration. She's going to laugh and maybe be embarrassed. She gave me this illustration. She says, what about clothing? Does anybody put on their outer clothing first and their underwear on afterwards? Does that work? Doesn't work very well. You're building a house. You make the roof first? Well, I suppose you could, but then you'd have to prop it up and get it up there some funny way later. The sequence makes a difference, and in the biblical story, the sequence makes a huge difference. Because God always starts with grace, which should result and is meant to result in what? Loving obedience. But if you put the loving obedience or obedience first, you mess it all up. You've got to have the right sequence and the right order. And all these texts, the one in Deuteronomy 11 that we read, and all these texts that talk about obeying and living come in what context? God has already delivered Israel. Even the Ten Commandments. Look at the order of the book of Exodus. Look at the sequence. What happens in the book of Exodus? What comes first? In what chapter in Exodus are the Ten Commandments? Verse 20, or chapter 20. Chapter 20. Okay. So why do the commandments come in chapter 20? What's happened in Exodus 1 to 19? Deliverance, the story of God's deliverance, the story of God's grace, God's action of grace in the lives of people is what's taking place. And then comes the Ten Commandments. And even in the Ten Commandments, let me tell you this, I need to mention this, and I've seen Adventist churches that have the Ten Commandments up there. You can put the Ten Commandments up there, but if you put the Ten Commandments up there, don't forget the verse that precedes the Ten Commandments. What is the verse that precedes the Ten Commandments? Huh? I am the Lord your God who have brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore, actually it shouldn't say that, but the implication is there. Therefore, thou shalt have no other gods before me, because I delivered you. So, the Exodus comes first. The deliverance comes first. Then comes the call to loving obedience. And that, chapter 11 that we read in Deuteronomy, many, many other passages that call for obedience, they always call for obedience to people who have been grace received, grace blessed, grace led, delivered already. The Ten Commandments come to the Israelites standing outside the land of bondage, not inside the land of bondage. And people who have been delivered from the land of bondage need to be called to loving obedience. That comes later. Sequence is important. The order is important. Underwear comes before outerwear. And last year, during the lesson study, I think here at camp meeting, I've heard some people quote it already here again this year. The statement was made by somebody who I know very well, that rules without relationships lead to rebellion. Okay? You could say it a different way. Duty before deliverance brings death. And we need to remember that in our lives. And the answer to the person who says God is a legalist doesn't understand the sequence and the order, and they're reading that little text all isolated by itself and not realizing that this is part of God's broad picture. I've chosen Abraham by grace, therefore I call him to obedience to me. I am Lord, and I have manifested that lordship by deliverance and saving. So, the answer to that first objection, I think, comes very clearly. God calls people to obey who have already been delivered from bondage by his grace. Amen. That's the same way he does it today. He does it in our lives. He does it with our children, and we need to remember that sequence. It's very important. Well, not only do we look at sequence, we need to look a little bit at the culture. Okay? Because we live in a different culture. I tell my students, I've taught Old Testament a number of years, and I've told my students time and time again that you need to go to the Old Testament with the same attitude that a cross-cultural missionary goes overseas. What is that attitude? I'm from one culture, they're from another culture. They may not see things exactly like I see things, therefore I better what? Do my best to understand what they're saying and why they're saying it, and try to understand myself better in the process. We've trained a lot of missionaries, and many of them say after the period of training, they say, I've learned that I need to be sensitive to other cultures, but they say, actually in learning about sensitivity to other cultures, I've learned more about my own culture than I've ever known before. Let me just give you an example of the kind of thing that can happen. Most Americans, at least middle-class Americans, and I'm guessing, I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm willing to bet that almost everybody here is in this category. You do not have servants that live in your house. How many of you have servants living in your house? You have servants cooking the food, you have cook, maybe somebody cleaning that. Well, there might be a few people that have somebody cleaning their house, but most of us are people who don't have servants. Okay, I grew up in a home where there were no servants. Only who had servants? Rich, and maybe very rich people had servants. Okay, so we heard that when you go overseas, and we were going to Thailand, when you go to Thailand, most people have servants. But we thought, well, we're poor missionaries. We want to represent Jesus Christ. We want to be humble. We're not going to have servants. Those are for rich people, and those are for people who, want to take advantage of others, and it's not a good thing. Okay, so we go. And we don't have servants, and several people apply and ask about, no, we can do it, we can do it, we're fine. Which, of course, basically means my wife is doing most of it. And then all of a sudden we start to hear rumors and people talking. The word is going around that these new missionaries are very sticky. I say that because the word for stingy in Thai means sticky. If you're stingy, it means that the money is sticking to you. You can't get it off. They're sticky people. So the word's going around that these new missionaries are sticky people. Kineo, sticky. And we thought, well, why are we, they say we're stingy, And the word came back, well, you're stingy because obviously you have plenty of money to hire servants, and you're stingy. You don't want to share your money with anybody. We got students who need education, and they need scholarships, and they need money, and you're keeping it all, and you're not giving anybody any jobs. That was a whole new way of looking at it. Never thought of it that way before. That's the way they have interpreted it. Guess what happened? What do you think happened? Didn't take very long for us to have 2 or 3 servants. Students working in the house. It wasn't always fun, and it didn't always help a lot because most of them didn't know what they were supposed to do, and it took as long to train them as it did anything else. It didn't really help that much, but we were no longer sticky. That was an insight that came from looking at another culture. Now, many people who come to the Old Testament evaluate the Old Testament completely from their own culture and forget that the Israelites may have understood things differently. And there are a number of ways in which that happens. It happens, most of the destruction of the people, the enemies of Israel, was not worried about by the Israelites of God destroying anybody. It was God delivering them from their enemies. It was God's deliverance. It was God saving them, helping them, blessing them. Another major difference is we are a very individualistic culture. In the Old Testament, it's a corporate culture. There's much more groupthink. And this is what you have a lot in the whole issue of families and animals and so forth being destroyed. Those are looked on by the Israelites in their culture as kind of a unit. We separate everybody out individually. They had a lot of groupthink. Do you know, as I thought about that, we really aren't, what should I say, as individualistic maybe as we think we are. We, of course, live in Walla Walla, College Place, wonderful place where instead of having the university, the city fathers way back in early times decided to have the state penitentiary instead of the university, because they said, at least with the penitentiary, the inmates are cooped up. If we have a university, the inmates are running wild. So they chose the penitentiary. Okay. So we have, I don't know how many people, I go minister there periodically. I don't know how many people are in there, but they're in there for their individual sin. But what about their families? We have wives of inmates. We have children of inmates. What happens to them? Ostracized, looked down on, made fun of. All kinds of ways. They may not be inside the prison, but is the incarceration of a father or a mother punishment for them too? Yes. They get punished too. And we need to remember that when punishment comes to one person, it often affects much broader space. So it isn't so much that happens. And you have the story of Achan too. And somebody said, well, what about the children? And I said, I don't really understand all of it. I know one thing, that if you're burying a big thing in a tent, there's more than one person that knows about it. And they may have been involved as well. But the biggest thing, probably the biggest thing of all that I would say is when destruction comes and these things come, are they the first death or the second death? What do you think? Huh? Is it first death or is it the second death? I would understand it to be the first death. If it's the first death, it does not mean that these people are eternally lost, right? God accepts and judges in the end on what their life is, and they may have suffered in a war or something that killed someone, but that is not the final end. That is the first death. First death. There's another thing to remember. One of the ways the Old Testament teaches about sin is to show the consequences of sin. That God is serious, and that when sin comes, it's a challenging thing. It disrupts nature, and it is a terrible thing. Another thing I like to tell people, they say, well, you can point to these texts in the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Ananias and Sapphira. That was pretty swift judgment. The book of Revelation. We have to realize that sin is real, and very often when sin comes, there are results. Sometimes results that we deem tragic, difficult, but God is at work, and He is at work. The nature of sin requires we see the consequences of its action in our lives and in the lives of other people as well. What I would suggest to you this morning is that this God that we serve has a reason behind every single one of these things that takes place. If you look around the Israelites, the gods of the people around the Israelites were often capricious. There were no reasons given. A god could do whatever he or she wanted to do without making any clear moral decision. In fact, many of the decisions were immoral. But there's a difference in the Old Testament. Things may come, judgments may come, but those judgments are always in the Old Testament what? Based on something moral. Sin was involved. Salvation for God's people was involved. There were reasons for everything given. Now, when you come to the whole picture that you see, I would go even one step further. Well, first I would say some things there are still a mystery, but I would say there's so many good things that God does that we should be able to wait to heaven to get complete answers. We know enough good things. We can give some suggestions of reasons. We may not be able to answer everything, and I don't claim to do that, but we can trust that one day God will make it plain for us. And we have enough wonderful things and good things that we can bank on that. But I want to take one step further. I want to say not only is God gracious in the Old Testament like he is in the New Testament, I want to say that the portrayals of God's grace in the Old Testament can even teach people from the New Testament things that they didn't necessarily think about so clearly. Let's apply that to our lives. One of the things that I like about Hebrew thought is that it leads to a different place than Greek thought. A very famous Jewish philosopher has said that Greeks learn so that they can understand. Hebrews, the Old Testament, studies so that they may worship. For a Greek, the end is understanding. For a Hebrew, the end is worship. There's a major difference there. We, in our position, are really the inheritors of that Greek philosophical tradition. And people think if they can explain and understand things, it will, in fact, cause them to be able to believe or do or act or whatever. In Hebrew, you study and you learn, and the end result is not understanding. The end result is worship. And that we see so clearly in the Old Testament. In fact, Christians didn't invent a new book dedicated to worship. What did we do? We adopted the Old Testament, and we adopted what book, which is the book of worship? Psalms. Song and prayer. When God's grace touches the lives of people, they worship. That makes a difference. The three angels' messages, what is the initial call? Fear God, which is a way of worship. Fear God. Give glory to him, worship. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of water. The renewal of God's people comes when there is a renewal of worship. That's what happens. And so what I'm really urging you at the end, as I come to a conclusion for my time with you, what I'm really urging at the end is that we not only learn about the God of grace, that we celebrate the God of grace in worship. What can Christians learn about grace in the Old Testament? They can learn about worship. They can learn about the variety of ways that God communicates. They can study how God acts in different cultures, and they can learn from him what makes a difference in their lives. A few years ago, we had some friends of ours visit from California. And the week that they were there on the Sabbath, they invited me to give the lesson study in the junior class, the juniors of the church, which is a real challenge. I think I'd rather talk to university students. For me, at least, it's easier. As we were preparing for the lesson, which happened to be on the story of Lazarus, as we were preparing for the story, we got up early Sabbath morning, and it was a time about like this before Sabbath school. We got together, and I also asked my brother-in-law to join us. So there was 3 of us. We decided instead of just talking about the story of Lazarus, we would do a pantomime of the story of Lazarus. Okay? So we got together Sabbath morning, read through the text, practiced the pantomime of Lazarus for the juniors. And we came to that point, we came to the point where Lazarus was resurrected and coming out of the tomb. He was resurrected, he was coming out of the tomb, and all of a sudden, my friend stopped, Stephen stopped, and he said, he said, I can't help but believe that when Lazarus comes out of the tomb and sees the Jesus who has resurrected him, that he would fall down before him and worship. It has to be that way. And all 3 of us just suddenly stopped, and the insight hit us. We've been doing this story, and we're talking about this story, and all of a sudden, we looked at it from the standpoint of the man who has been resurrected by his Savior, and what he would do would be worship. Now, it doesn't say that in the Bible, but Ellen White in Desire of Ages says that he did. That's exactly what he did. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? See, that's really the end of the story of Old Testament grace. Old Testament grace is not only seeing those texts about God's grace, it's not only about hearing those stories of God's grace. It's not only about trying to answer questions about God's grace. It's about having a heart that responds to God in worship. And I would just urge you to begin to practice that in your lives. We've been very good at talking about worship and giving reasons to worship. Keeping the Sabbath and honoring God as Creator is a reason to worship. Seeing the story of redemption take place in our lives and in the lives of other people, that's good. We're learning. But that's not really the punchline. The punchline comes when we kneel before God and say, you've been so gracious to me. I wouldn't be here without you. I couldn't minister or live without your presence. So I give you glory and honor. You see, that's so important because that is what really demonstrates that you understand grace. If you earn your way, okay, then there's no reason to worship because you've already done it. But if you know you could not have done it, never could have done it, and but by the grace of God would not have any hope, when you realize that in the depths of your being, the only thing that is possible is what? Worship. So I invite you, my brothers and sisters, to worship. Worship daily. Sometimes in our morning devotions, our time with God, it's a mental exercise. Let it be a time of praise, glory, and celebration of the God who is gracious all through both Old Testament and New Testament as well. Let's pray. Father in heaven, you are a gracious gracious God. You've chosen all kinds of unworthy people. You've chosen us. You've been merciful to us. You call us to obedience because you've saved us. Lord, help us this morning not only to understand your grace, but to celebrate your grace and to worship. Worship by our lives, worship by our obedience, worship by bowing before you, worship by acknowledging you, worship by honoring your Sabbath, worship you by praise. Whatever way you impress us, show us how to not only understand, but to bow before you and worship in our lives. Lord, my brothers and sisters have gathered here because they want to seek you, they want to know you deeply. I pray that you will come near to each one this morning. May we sense your presence as we celebrate together. And may we honor you by our lives, we pray. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.